Hope you like this. If you do, give it a thumbs up and leave any comments below. And remember to subscribe to the channel to be kept up to date on all my hypnotic bedtime stories. So I hope you enjoy the story.
So as you begin to drift comfortably asleep with your eyes closed, you can listen to me talking in the background. And I don't know whether you'll drift deeper with the sound of my voice or the words that I use, or whether you'll drift deeper into sleep with the spaces between my words. And so as you begin to fall asleep, you can listen to me tell this story in the background. And there was a monk in a monastery, and every day since being in this monastery, he would walk around the monastery in a purposeful way, following the same route each day, before settling down under a tree to meditate. And this tree was in the monastery gardens. He'd settle down under that tree to meditate. And this day, while this monk began to meditate, he started to see space. He started to see some kind of a craft in space. He started to have a sense of this craft floating through space, weightless. And he had no concept or idea about space. But like all his meditations, he accepted it for what it was and he just went with it. And he had this sense of being on some kind of a spacecraft as it circled the earth. And he could see the earth below. And he was curious. He'd never seen what the earth looked like from space. He could see the continents, the oceans. He could see clouds. And as the ship circled the earth, he could see the sun peering out from behind the earth. And at other times he could see the moon peering out from behind the earth. And he was curious what he was learning during this meditation. And he took some time to focus on his weightlessness. And he thought to himself about how the only time he'd ever felt like this before was when he would jump off a cliff into the ocean as a boy. And that for the time between jumping off the cliff and reaching the ocean, he would feel exhilarated. And yet he would also feel weightless. And he thought to himself how this experience in space feels just like that. And as he gazed down from space, he could notice areas that he knew must be forests. And he wondered how much higher than the tallest trees he must be. He noticed areas of mountains, and he was aware of how far away everything looked from up here. And as he looked out the window in the opposite direction, he could see the familiar night sky, only there were far more stars and colours. And nothing was twinkling. And he found this curious. And he thought to himself how this spacecraft is a bit like a palace in space. As he pushed his way down the craft, and he could see areas for sleeping, areas that looked like you could play games and do different things. But he couldn't understand how, because you just floated. And then he noticed how this craft began to point away from the earth. And he heard something moving. And he saw someone else who was on this journey with him, pressing a button. And as that sound of movement occurred, he started to feel himself falling to the floor. And he realized somehow that person had turned the gravity on. And he went and looked out the windows, and he saw that the bit of craft he was in was turning. And the craft began to move out of the orbit of the Earth and started accelerating in a new direction. And he didn't know at this point where the craft was going. He felt this meditation was almost prophetic. It was almost like somehow he was seeing something in the future. Because he'd never heard of crafts in space. He'd never imagined anything like this, and yet it all felt so real to him. And as that craft travelled further away from the earth, so he was able to look out the windows and watch that pale blue dot moving further back into the distance. And he could see the grey moon near that pale blue dot, both moving further into the distance. And he settled himself in for the journey, wondering what he'll learn next. And the further away from the earth that ship got, the faster the ship was getting. And he learned that this ship was travelling to another planet, to learn about another civilization, to see what life is like elsewhere. And he was curious by this. He had connected with different life on Earth in his meditations. He had connected with past lives, but this is the first time he'd connected with a future life. And he hadn't even thought that there would be life away from the Earth. He hadn't even thought about the idea that there could be other Earths. So this was all fascinating and curious to him. And as the journey set in, he noticed how much free time he had, where there was nothing to do but travel and occasionally check that everything's working okay. And so he sat himself down and drifted into a meditation. And in this meditation he could feel the movement of the ship. He could feel a connection with those on the ship. And he began to spread his awareness outside of the ship. And for the first time he began to spread his awareness out into the universe, to see what else his awareness could connect with. And as he drifted and meditated on that ship, he began to sense that when you let your awareness spread out into the universe, you realize the universe is full of consciousness, ready and willing to connect with you. And so he allowed his connection to occur with different consciousnesses throughout the universe. And after regular extended meditations over many months, the monk was informed that the ship was nearing its destination. And the monk went and looked out the window and could see this planet getting closer. Could see that it looked like Earth but didn't. And as the ship started circling the planet, so the monk went down to the surface in a small craft to go and explore this planet. And on the surface, the monk exited the ship and was greeted by a slightly different smell of air, and yet it felt familiar and was breathable. Of what looked a bit like long grass, but wasn't. And the monk reached down and ran his hand through that, and it felt a bit like long grass, but it was a different plant. And the monk could see what looked like tall trees, but again they weren't familiar. And the monk wandered off and explored, and had been tasked with heading to a specific set of coordinates. And so the monk followed a device in those directions towards those coordinates. And as the monk walked, the monk took in their surroundings, what the world sounded like, what everything felt like, the breeze on his face, a sense of deep curiosity and wonder. And the monk could see a pyramid off in the distance, and assumed that that must be where he's heading. And he continued walking towards that pyramid, and he wondered about why it would be a pyramid, and he thought to himself about how, if you're creating a structure to last, a pyramid is a good structure. And as he approached the pyramid, so he noticed that there were symbols around that pyramid, and he took records of the symbols before finding a way into the pyramid. And he noticed as he entered the pyramid how the sound changed, how the sound went from not echoey to being slightly echoey, how the sound of the wind suddenly sounded a little deeper as he walked deeper and deeper into the pyramid. And as he walked into the pyramid, he wondered what he would find. He could notice the way the light bounced around the walls. And then eventually he found an opening to a vast chamber. And in the centre of that chamber was a propped up stone block, at least twice the height of the monk, and at least as wide as his arms could stretch. And he started reading what was on that stone tablet. And it was different symbols, different metaphorical language. And he was tasked with trying to understand this. And he always found meditation helped. And so he reached forward and rested a hand on that stone tablet. And as he rested a hand on the stone tablet, he allowed his eyes to close. And while his eyes were closed, he felt his mind beginning to connect with the tablet through the sensations through his fingertips. And as he connected with that tablet, so he began to get visions of the content of the tablet, and realized that this tablet was teaching a way of life of an ancient civilization, was teaching what came before and where they went after, and how they actually were spreading into the universe, how they wanted to be star people. how they built these giant pyramids as a way of transferring knowledge to those who discover. How they'd built vast pyramids on planets they'd visited. As a way of transferring and storing knowledge. And so, after the monk learned what he needed to know, he found his way out of the pyramid, found his way back through jungle, back through meadows, all the way back to the ship. And he took off in the ship, back up to the ship circling the planet. He docked with that ship, explained his findings. Before that ship started its journey back towards the Earth, and as it did, they kicked in the gravity again, and the ship started its journey back. And while on its journey back, the monk took time to meditate on the ship, time to absorb connecting with universal consciousness, to absorb connecting with the consciousness of beings throughout this universe. And the monk didn't know what time or place this was. Just that this obviously wasn't a past life, so it must be a future life. And the monk wanted to hang on to learning, wanted to hang on to discovering what would be helpful to apply to his time. And as the craft arrived back at the Earth and circled around the Earth once more, the monk found himself feeling compelled to go and sit down and meditate. And as he sat down and meditated, so he began to hear the sounds of birds. He began to feel the breeze on his face. He began to feel the tree against his back. And as he gently opened his eyes, he found himself back in that monastery in his own time. And he hung on to the experience that he'd had and the learning that he'd had. And like he usually does, he went and recorded his experience to make sure it could be shared with others, and to make sure that others begin to realize that there's more life out there than just the life around you that you can see. That this place we call Earth is only one of tens of thousands, if not millions, of Earths. That life from advanced civilizations down to the most primitive basic life exists throughout the universe. And the monk felt it was his duty to begin to share this knowledge, share this wisdom, to teach about how we're not the most important thing We're not the only thing. We're just one thing. We're part of a web of life, a connection with all things. And that night the monk found himself drifting off asleep, thinking and dreaming about that future, dreaming about when that future was, and what other futures may be ahead of him to experience. And he enjoyed just drifting, floating, falling asleep in those dreams.